Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening, everyone. This is Shane Gebauer with Brushy Mountain Bee Farm. I'd like to welcome you this evening to our webinar discussing winter preparation. We're going to go ahead and get started. Just so you know, we will have some time, I hope anyway, for some question and answer at the end of the presentation. It's difficult for me to see those questions during the presentation, but if you go ahead and type them into the question panel, I'll do my best at the end to read through them and answer them aloud. So if you have any questions, go ahead and type them in. Regarding tonight's presentation or anything, we'll take them based on the content first, and then if there's others, we can certainly try and get to them. So let's go ahead and get started. Winter prep. So here we are in mid to late September, and many of us are just getting through summer and into very early fall, depending on where you are in the country or the world. But we are just finishing up the hotter part of the month. So why are we talking about winter preparation? Well, more specifically, we're going to focus on the late season, what I call late season winter prep. And the reason for that is that your bees, for the most part, again, it varies a little bit depending on where you are, but your bees have already begun that winter prep, and much of your work in really getting that hive healthy should already be done. And we're going to touch on this in just a little bit. But basically, at this point, your colony should be more or less ready to go into winter. And so what we want to focus on here this evening are what are some of those really late season things that you can do to encourage and foster that colony to survive winter. So let's get into this a little bit. First off, we have to start early, right? So that's why here it is mid-September, and we're talking about late season prep, because early season prep would have started in August, maybe late July, depending on, again, where you are. If you're in southern states, southern climates, maybe early September, but you've got to start early. And by winter prep, what I'm really referring to is mite management. And I know that many of you that are beekeepers are probably sick and tired of hearing about mites, about Varroa. But the reason why you constantly hear about them is because they continue to be public enemy number one for beekeepers. We are simply not doing our part to keep mites under control. So you've got to start early, and starting early means a healthy hive, because if you're starting at this point in time, and we'll see this in the next couple of slides, it's a lot of the winter prep from the colony's perspective has already been done. So it's going to be difficult for those bees, if they're reared under high mite levels, to be healthy as they go into winter. And so that's going to lessen the likelihood that that colony is going to survive. We've got to have food reserves. As we know, bees do not hibernate. They don't go dormant. They remain active all winter long. So we've got to have adequate food reserves, either ensuring that they are storing enough honey on their own, or if they're not, that we are supplementing that food with corn syrup or sugar water or some form of carbohydrate that can fuel their heat furnaces to generate heat during the winter and keep the queen warm. So food reserves. And last, we've got to deal with moisture control. And we're going to take each one of these in turn as we go through the presentation. So first off, right, this is from Bee Informed Partnership. We know we are losing way too many colonies. You can see the data here. Total winter loss is sort of that yellowish color, what we deem to be acceptable winter loss based on environmental conditions, what we know is achievable with good management, best management practices. You can see we are having way too high a loss in winter, but also just total annual loss. We are not doing our part as beekeepers to ensure our colonies are healthy and thriving before going into winter. And it's important to note that a good, strong colony, a good, healthy colony, rather, is not necessarily, you can't judge it by its population. Just because there are a lot of bees in that box, in that hive, does not equate to a healthy colony. So population does not equate to health. So just simply looking at the numbers is not good enough. We've got to look at some other indicators to determine whether the colony is healthy and thus its likelihood to survive winter. So we've got to do better at best management practices and prepping our colonies for winter. And it's also worth noting that amongst the industry, there's really, we can think about the beekeeping industry in two very different ways, although we all face the same challenges. But those two different ways are sort of the backyard sideline beekeeper that have just a few colonies, and the commercial beekeepers that are moving colonies across the country, doing the pollination services, really ensuring that we have food on the table. There's sort of very different aspects of how those colonies are dealt with, but ultimately the underlying issues, Varroa, food, moisture, etc., all those things are constants regardless of the number of colonies you manage. However, there's this notion that much of these numbers right here that we're looking at, these data, are so high, the losses are so high because of the commercial beekeepers, because the stressors that are being put on those bees as they're being moved around the country into monocultures, etc. But if we look at, again, some additional information from Bee Informed Partnership, we really see that it's the backyard beekeepers, and I suspect many of you listening tonight fall into that backyard beekeeper category or sideline beekeeper category. Maybe we've got a commercial person or two on tuning in, but really it's the backyard beekeepers that are having the highest percentage of loss. And quite honestly, if anything, intuitively we should think it should be just the opposite. If you've got 2 hives in your backyard, it's very easy to go through those 2 hives every week, every other week. Versus a beekeeper that's got 10,000 hives, it's impossible for that person to go through all those colonies on such a frequent schedule. So the backyard beekeeper really has the ability to be in touch with what's going on inside their hive, but still we're seeing exceptionally high losses from this particular segment. So again, we've got to do better. And there's also this notion that of survivor stock for dealing with Varroa. And in essence, what that means is I have 10 hives, I'm going to just let things run their course, and I'm going to let the weak ones die, and I'll select from the strong ones survivor stock, sort of hastening that natural evolution, that co-adapting process that where the host and pest kind of become in balance with one another. But we see that that's simply not working. And there's a lot of very good behavioral and biological reasons why that's not happening and why that strategy is not an effective strategy for the industry. And again, if we look at this, 48% of the people of the bees were lost in that category of people that don't do anything. They don't use any product, versus 35% loss for those that used at least one product. And it's important to note here, we're saying product, we're saying treatment, but there's some things that are included in that list that are considered organic, or that are essential oils, that are organic acids, that are not hard chemicals, that do not leave long-lasting residues inside the hive. And so we've got to do something. And this is sort of that early season winter prep that we need to think about. So these sorts of things, these winter, or rather late summer, early fall treatments in dealing with the Varroa population should have been occurring late July, August, maybe early September, depending on where you're located. And so know your mite levels, know what's going on inside your hive. Do a sugar shake, right? So the first annual Mite-a-thon was just held. Every one of us should have been doing sugar shakes and submitting that information to the Bee Informed Partnership so that they've got good data that can help map Varroa populations across the country and see how that population may influence survivorship going through winter, etc. But basically, if you have one mite per 100 bees, you are at the treatment threshold. So you've got to do something. If you've got more than that, if you've got more than one mite per 100 bees, your colony is at risk. Your colony is not going to be healthy. Those bees are not going to survive winter, and you're going to end up with a colony that's dead in spring. And the reason why is Varroa is it's not necessarily the Varroa that's causing the problems, but rather this Varroa virus interaction that is really impacting the colonies. Colonies with high Varroa levels, those bees typically have lower body mass. They're immunocompromised. They typically have shorter life expectancy. And so if your colony is raising winter bees essentially now or in October, and the life expectancy of those bees is shorter, how is that colony going to survive into February, March, or April when that colony starts to grow its population again? It's not. And worse than just the Varroa again are these viruses. So if we look at sort of the bee population inside a colony, we see it typically peaks around June or July, again, depending on where you are. And the mite population typically peaks later after that. So that exponential growth occurs later in the season than the exponential growth of the bees. And if we look at this, if we look at August, July and August, that's when we're starting to really see that exponential growth and the peaking of the mite populations. We have to nip that in the bud and bring that population back down to a manageable level for the colony. And again, if we look at the viruses that are vectored by these Varroa or that are naturally occurring in the colony but seem to be at higher levels when Varroa is present, they're peaking in October. And again, at this point in October, our queens are shutting down. The bees that are in that hive, for the most part, are going to be the same bees that we need to survive until January, February, March. And if they've got high virus levels at that point, they simply are not going to make it. So these are two different types of viruses that were measured. Organic in this regard is not organically managed colonies, but again, those organic acids. So we have to start earlier to prevent this from happening. So these sorts of things, the viruses that are in the colony that are moving through the bees, moving from queen down to egg, in future generations, we have to bring the Varroa down to levels that allow these virus loads to sort of diminish, just like the Varroa population diminishes after a treatment. We need to bring these levels down prior to those bees being reared that we want to survive winter. So this is why the treatments are considered pre-winter preparation, early winter preparation, not necessarily late season preparation. Now, so hopefully most of you have taken care of that. You've done the early winter preparation, which is really dealing with your mite loads, making sure that they're low. And I'll just mention here that it doesn't mean that you just focus on Varroa July, August, September. Really, we should be focused on Varroa all season long, including spring, summer, and fall, fall being late fall, early winter. And that's why here we're talking about fall treatments. Again, best management practices that are coming out, that are emerging from the data that Bee Informed is collecting and publishing on an annual basis, shows beekeepers that treat their colonies 3 times a year have the best overwintering success. And again, that word treatment has a negative connotation. It does not necessarily mean you have to put a hard chemical inside your hive. It can be organic acids. It can be essential oils. If it's earlier in the season, spring, early summer, It can be IPM techniques, integrated pest management techniques, things that don't require anything to be put in that hive, but you've got to deal with the Varroa. So let's spend, the next half hour or so discussing these late season preparation tasks. What we need to focus on here is adequate food reserves. We need to focus on moisture control, and again, possibly that fall, late fall, early winter treatment. And there's really just a handful of options at that time. So let's start with the food reserves. 60 to 80 pounds worth of honey. Again, depending on where you're located, rather, it might be a little less, it might be a little more. If you're in the northern reaches of Maine, you're going to be on the high side, if not more than 80 pounds of honey in that colony to survive winter. If you're down in Florida, then you're going to be on the low side of 60. Depending on where in Florida, you might have some source of nectar, some source of pollen just about year round, in which case having those strong reserves, food reserves, is not necessarily as important as the northern tip of Maine. But you want to have about 60 to 80 pounds of carbohydrates. Now, here's a frame of honey. That's what the bees produce. Certainly, leaving that for them is advantageous. However, some years they might not be able to produce that. This year is a case in point. Early estimates suggest that the honey production is down 25%. So in some places, if you didn't harvest anything, your bees still might not have what they need to make winter, and so you've got to feed. Or maybe you thought it was going to be a great year, you took some honey in spring, and they didn't have a chance to build up enough stores after that, and so you're going to have to look at feeding. For feeding, and we'll talk about moisture in a second, but for feeding purposes, you want to do a 2-to-1 mixture of sugar to water if you're mixing your own, 2 parts sugar to 1 part water. And the reason why you want it thicker than in fall than you do in spring it's a 1-to-1. The reason why you want it thicker in fall is because the moisture inside that hive, you don't want to increase the moisture content. You don't want them to make it to be more difficult for them to cure that honey. You don't want them to have to ventilate that hive when it gets cold because of that excess moisture. It also runs the risk of fermenting if it's got too high a moisture content. So 2 parts sugar to 1 part water. You can use corn syrup, you can use sugar water, whatever your preference. Now, the question that we often get is, how do you know? How do you know how much honey is inside your hive, and how do you know if it's going to be enough? So one of the things that I do is I'm working my hive is, let's say I'm going through this hive and I've got medium frames. Well, all medium frames. Medium frames are going to hold about, if they're full, chock full, wall to wall, really drawn out well, a frame's going to hold about 4 pounds. A deep frame's going to be up around 6, maybe 7 pounds worth of honey. So as I'm working my hive, I'm keeping a mental list of, well, there's a full frame, that's about 4 pounds. There's a frame that's only full on one side because maybe it was on the outside edge of the box. So there's 2 pounds. Now I've got 6, and I keep that mental tally and add it all up and say, okay, well, I've got 50, I've got 40, I've got 80, whatever that weight is. And then I go to the back of the hive and I gently try and lift up that corner so that I know what 50 pounds of honey feels like, if that's what I summed in my head as I was doing that inspection. There are techniques. You can get those spring scales that are capable of handling the weight of a hive, and you lift up the front and you lift up the back and you add those 2 numbers together, and that gives you a pretty good idea of the total weight of the hive. You've got to back out the weight of equipment. In a box, typically you can figure about 10 pounds, and frames with the wax, if you're figure maybe roughly a 1/4 pound or so, and then you've got the bees. It's easier for me anyway to just mentally add it up in my mind rather than trying to back out the weight of equipment. Another way to do it is if you have a hive scale. So hive scales are great. So this is, if you look at the dates, you can see that this is earlier in the season. This is in May. So you can see the colony storing nectar. You can see the colony producing that honey. And so we know that they're gaining weight. We can see how much weight they're gaining. We can easily calculate how much food is inside that hive. And we can also see when to add supers. Now, this isn't necessarily winter prep, but we can also see that here, basically mid-July, they started to consume. And so I can see, okay, well, they're consuming, they're no longer producing. So do I really want to take that sourwood honey off? If I want to maximize my honey production and I'm doing this for revenue, maybe I do. But for me, just as a hobby, I can leave it on there and leave it as a food source. And now with this hive scale, I can also track exactly what the weight is and whether they are going to run out of food or not. I can also say, gosh, I took honey and now I'm way too light on my colony and I'm going to be looking at having to feed food back to them, whether it be, again, that corn syrup or sugar water. I've got to put food back on that colony. So 60 to 80 pounds of carbohydrates, whether it be sugar water, whether it be honey, but you've got to have that going into winter because bees don't hibernate. They need that carbohydrate source to generate heat to keep the cluster warm and the queen at the optimal temperature, regardless of outside ambient temperature. And again, if you don't have that weight, you've got to feed. There's lots of different ways to feed: pail feeders, entrance feeders, top feeders, frame feeders, lots of different ways to feed. Here's the thing about feeding, though. You can, at most places in the country right now, you can still feed liquid syrup to them. But ultimately, what's going to happen is as we get deeper into fall and the temperatures start to drop, that colony is going to begin to cluster. And at that point, those bees will not be able to access the feeder. So we've got a small window of opportunity right now to fill those frames with the resources that colony needs. Because once it gets cold, you can put the syrup to them, you can put the feeder on there, you can leave it there, but they will not be able to access it if they're clustered. Now, yes, maybe they'll get a warm December day or a warm January day, and they might be able to get in there, but a 1 or 2 day warm spell is not going to be enough time for them to replenish the resources that they need inside the comb, inside the frames that they are clustering on. And so you've got to make sure they've got the reserves now before they start that clustering period. I'll be honest, these types of products, Honeybee Healthy, Hive Alive, more recently the Super DFM, when they first started coming out, Honeybee Healthy was the first product. I thought it was more for the beekeeper than it was for the bees. I thought that it was really designed to make the beekeeper feel good and warm and fuzzy that they're doing, all they can to promote good hive health inside the colony. And isn't that great? Well, there's some really great information out there, both anecdotal data as well as some studies that have done that show colonies being in a much healthier state with Honeybee Healthy, with Hive Alive, and also the Super DFM, which are feed supplements that you can give the hive to encourage hive health. They're not treatments. You can think of them as vitamins, like you would take a multivitamin in the morning. That's what you can think of these as. Super DMF, I'll just say, is a little bit different. This is more of a probiotic type of thing. It's a mixture of bacteria that help create sort of that digestive balance of bacteria. You don't want to mix this in with liquid feed. This would be a dry powder that you would apply to the colony. If you mix it in with liquid, those bacteria can become active prematurely and not have the benefit that they would have if they were fed in a dry state. So I have come around on these products and typically will use one, if not a combination of these when feeding, because it definitely seems to have a positive effect on the health of the colony. The one thing I'll mention in particular about Honeybee Healthy, although Hive Alive to some extent, these have lemongrass as an essential oil, which is great because it attracts the bees. It encourages them to get up into the feeder and take the syrup. However, if you're using them during the summer months when there might be a dearth and robbing is a likelihood, it can also attract robbing bees. And so you've definitely got to be careful if you're using these during, like we started feeding in July because it's been such a bad honey year here. And so we would not use necessarily these products at that time because of the potential for robbing. As we get later into fall and the potential diminishes somewhat, then we can certainly add them in at that point. Let's say you're doing everything you can. You're socking the syrup to them, the liquid feed to them, and you don't get enough in that colony, or you think you've got enough, but then you get that Indian summer in January or February, and you go to that colony and you do your weight check. You lift up that back corner, which now you've sort of calibrated that, right? Because you did that mental tally during the growing season of what X amount of honey felt like inside that colony. And when you lift that corner in January or February, you realize those bees do not have adequate food reserves. You've got to do something. So this is, something you can do in December or January. Again, they will not access a feeder unless they get the proper temperatures. And if they do, it might just be for a day or two that they have those temperatures that they can get into the feeder. But fondant is a great emergency feed. You can throw it on the top bars as those bees consume the reserves that are in the frames. They can cluster right on or under that fondant and consume it from the cluster. They don't have to break that cluster to access the food. They can cluster on it and as they would a frame. So it's a good emergency feed later in the season. And you can also create your own style of frame feeders if you want. Take a frame of drawn comb and lay it on in a casserole dish or a casserole pan or baking dish or something like that, and sprinkle sugar, granulated sugar, on that frame. The grains of sugar are going to fall down into those cells. It's difficult to get liquid feed to drain into those cells the way the air and the way the air bubble forms. You can do it, but it's challenging. But if you take granulated sugar, sprinkle sugar on that frame, fill the cells up with sugar. Now, of course, when you pick it up, that sugar is going to fall out, or a good portion of it's going to fall out of those cells. So before you pick it up, sprinkle that sugar on, fill the cells, take a spray bottle and spray that frame with that spray bottle to create just a thin film of water. You don't want to saturate it. Again, we don't want moisture, and we're getting to the moisture aspect in a bit. You don't want to add a lot of moisture, but what's going to happen is you're going to create a thin layer of sticky sugar that's going to contain the granulated sugar in that cell. You can have these frames at the ready so that if you get that warm day in January or February, you go into that hive, you can pull a frame out and pop in one of those sugar frames. And again, it gives that colony a place to cluster and that has food. Now, again, this is not something that I would do unless it's an emergency situation. These are desperate times, desperate measures, and these are actions that can potentially keep that colony alive and prevent it from starving. So fondant, sugar frames, as we call them, with that granulated sugar, thin film of water so that it dissolves that outer layer and holds in that granulated sugar. and it gives the bees an area to cluster without having to break that cluster and access a feeder. So emergency feeding. Be prepared for it, be ready for it, and if you get that warm day, be proactive. Throw a fondant patty in there, put a frame in there so that when they need it and it's cold and you can't get in there, they've got it at that point. So be proactive in December and January and get that feed onto them. Securing the hive. So this is obviously a cute little mouse. Looks so cute. Big beady eyes, nice ears, little whiskers, but not so cute when you find them inside your colony. They make a mess. They typically will chew the foundation, the frame, and they tend to defecate in those frames, and it's just not a pleasant experience for you, the colony, the equipment, etc. So you want to reduce the entrance. We want to secure the entrance. This is again later in the season because right now most parts of the country bees are still actively flying. The temperatures are not such that they're sort of in that permanent cluster stage. But as we get later and those bees spend more and more time in a clustered state, that means they spend less and less time protecting the entrance, which means this mouse has free reign to come and go at that point. And if you're a mouse, what a great place to spend the winter. You're under cover, you've got a little bit of food, you're in this nice cozy environment. It's perfect place for a mouse in wintertime. So as those bees spend more and more time in the cluster, that's when you want to reduce the entrance to nothing more than an opening that's 3/8 of an inch in height. It can be wider if you want, but 3/8 of an inch. I've heard of mice squeezing through that gap, but it's difficult. And so you keep those mice out. So you want to secure your hive with a reducer. Once we get deeper into winter and those bees spend more time in the cluster than they do away from the cluster. Oh, to wrap or not to wrap. So this is the bee cozy wrapped around the hive. You can use tar paper, black tar paper that you can buy from a hardware store. People have used that foam board, either the blue or pink foam board, and cut it into pieces that are roughly the same dimensions of a hive, and then sort of fasten it to the hive to create some insulation. There's a lot of debate on wrapping and whether it has merit, and like most things in beekeeping, you ask 10 beekeepers this question and you're going to get 11 different answers, and it might also be influenced a little bit by geography, where you are in the country. I would say that first off, me personally, I don't wrap. And yes, you may be saying, well, he's in North Carolina. They don't really have winters, especially if you're sitting up in Maine. And certainly, I've lived in Maine. I know North Carolina does not have winters similar to Maine, but we do get cold. It's possible for sub-zero temperatures here in the Brushies. Not for long, but it's possible. I did live in the foothills of the Adirondacks in New York State for a while, and I never wrapped there. My concern is, as we look at this picture, if we get that spring thaw or winter, Indian summer in January or February, bees, you want them to be able to get out, right? So you can certainly wrap a hive and still create an exit route. But if you're going to wrap, make sure bees have a means to get out of that hive. Because if you get a 50-degree day in January, those bees are going to want to come out. They're going to want to go on a cleansing flight. And if you've got them sealed in, that's bad. The other thing about wrapping, and I mention it again, and we're going to spend a little bit more time on it, moisture. You want some ventilation to that hive. You want that air that's inside that colony, inside that equipment rather, to be vented out, because as the bees are in there, they're generating this moisture through respiration. So you've got to, if you wrap your hive, you've got to make sure you have some form of ventilation. You've got to make sure it's some form of exit so that the colony can go on cleansing flights. I would say if you're, if we drew a line maybe across, northern Pennsylvania, across through, half of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, kind of going across that direction. If you're north of that, maybe you would consider wrapping. If you're south of that, I don't think it's going to have much value for you. The thing about bees and wrapping, bees are very capable of dealing with cold. It's the cold in conjunction with moisture that really kills colonies. You've got to deal with the moisture. If you deal with the moisture, the bees will be able to tolerate the cold. You can do this trick, right? If you ever have a snowpack and it's middle of winter and you get that cleansing flight, the next day what you're going to see are some bees in that snow, or the same day later in the evening as the temperatures begin to drop. Because what happens is the reflection of the sun off the snow sort of disorients them. A lot of them invert and fly into the snow because they think they're flying up, but because of the reflection. But in reality, they're flying down into it. And once they come in contact with that cold snow, of course, now their body temperature drops and they can't make it back to the colony. If you scoop those bees up, you can breathe on them and revive them. And it illustrates just how capable they are of dealing with the cold. It's, again, the moisture that's really detrimental. And again, we'll spend more time with that. So here's a frame in early spring, a bunch of bee butts looking up at us. And you can see some of the mold on some of these bees around some of the cells. So did the bees die from starvation? Many would say yes, because of how they're oriented in the cells. Or did they die from cold, or maybe something else from Varroa? Either way, I would say that the bees weren't able to generate enough thermal mass to keep them warm. And maybe it's because the cluster size got too small due to sickness from viruses and Varroa. Maybe they couldn't generate enough thermal mass because they got wet. And use yourself as an example. Think about two very different days. One day that's 40 degrees and drizzly rain. It's overcast, drizzly rainy day, and you're outside all day long, versus a day that may be 20 degrees, but the air is dry. Which day would you rather be outside? I'll take that 20-degree day over that 40-degree day every single time. And again, the reason is moisture. Moisture wicks heat away from us, away from bees. So did the colony die from moisture? Did it die from starvation or something else? It died because it couldn't either, if it's starvation, obviously it didn't have food. Otherwise, it couldn't generate the thermal mass. Now, in this case, if we look closer, this is a photo from a woman, I believe she's up in Massachusetts, that you can see those white speckles. In this case, we're hedging our bets that it was Varroa, because that's Varroa feces. And so the cluster was weak, it was sick, and it didn't have enough bees to generate the heat to get to new food source. So we have got to deal with moisture. We've got to either vent it out of the hive or trap it. This is counterintuitive for us. We heat our homes. In wintertime, we turn up the thermostat, we start a fire in the fireplace or wood stove, whatever the case may be. We heat the airspace in our homes. The bees do not. The bees heat their cluster, right? So here is a drawing where we've got a little bit of a brood nest. You can see the temperatures minus 11 Celsius, which is 12 degrees Fahrenheit. And look at how the temperature drops as we move away. This is a 3-story colony. As you get down into that bottom story, it's 19 degrees when the outside temperature is 12. The bees are not heating their home. They are heating themselves. And so in doing that, they are consuming honey, they're vibrating those wing muscles to generate heat, and they're also breathing. Think of a day when you exhale on a window or in your car and you see your breath. And if you're exhaling on a window, that breath condenses because you've got that warm, moist air coming out of your body, hitting a cold surface, condensing that water vapor. Now, imagine this cluster breathing inside this colony, giving off that moisture, and we've got a cold inner cover above them. All that warm, moist air, if the cluster's down here or up top, all that warm, moist air is going to come up. It's going to hit that cold inner cover, and it's going to condense and accumulate and eventually possibly literally rain down on the bees. So if you want to insulate your hive, this is going back to the wrapping. If you want to insulate your hive, perhaps the best, most important area to insulate is the ceiling above that inner cover, so that inner cover does not get as cold and thus less likely to have the moisture condense on it and create moisture problems for the colony. Or trap it. There's easy ways to trap moisture. Have you ever tried to light newspaper on a day that has high humidity or maybe has a fog or a drizzle? Newspaper wicks up moisture like you would not believe. Take a little rim. You can make these at home if you want. Take a rim, put it on top of your inner cover, crumple up newspaper, throw it in there. It's going to wick that moisture up out of the colony. It's going to create sort of an insulation area so that your inner cover isn't as cold, and that newspaper is going to trap it. Very easy, inexpensive, great way to deal with moisture. You can take a similar thing and put wood shavings in there. Now, this is, let's be careful, there's a piece of material, of flannel or canvas stapled to the underside. You don't want all those wood shavings falling down into your hive. You can insulate the top with a wintering inner cover. So this has a piece of Homosote that helps insulate and deal with that moisture. Also has an area for an upper entrance if you want, a cap for feeding if you need to, so that you can put a jar feeder on the hive around an empty box, which will allow the colony to access it a little bit later into the season as opposed to an entrance feeder. So a wintering inner cover. This is probably one of the best devices, I think, for dealing with moisture. It's a Vivaldi board, so it's got a couple of features. Of course, it's got the vents so that it helps deal with that moisture once it comes up in here. It's got the screen that you can put over top of a hole, so you can put a fondant patty here and then cover this, or just granulated sugar. So you can open up your hive and see that they consume without actually exposing the bees. You could pull off your inner cover, and see this without exposing the cluster, and see that, gosh, they consumed that fondant patty, or they consumed that granulated sugar that I just dumped there as an emergency food. And they got to it, last week when we had that warm spell. So you can reapply and not disturb the cluster. And then you can also put burlap, newspaper, wood shaving, something of that nature as a loosely packed, you don't want to pack it tight, loosely packed there, again, to insulate that ceiling so that it's a little bit warmer, so you have less issues with moisture condensing on that underside and raining back down on the bees. But you've got to deal with the moisture somehow. Moisture's what kills bees. And then the last thing is plan ahead. Give your bees a jump start. Now, if you have done your part to get your bees ready for winter, there should be relatively few mites in that colony. But you can do a late fall, early winter treatment of oxalic acid. You can trickle, this is mixing up a sugar solution, trickling that sugar solution with the oxalic acid mixed into it onto the bees. You want to do, this is a treatment designed, or I shouldn't say designed, that's most effective. This is a treatment that's most effective late fall, early winter, because it works best when that colony has very little or no brood at all, because it only affects what we call the phoretic mites. These are mites that are on the adult bees. So Thanksgiving time is a perfect time to be applying this. still temperatures in most places that are conducive, that you can get in there, around that time of year, open your colony, trickle them with a little bit of this oxalic sugar solution, seal it back up, and now you are giving this colony a jump start in spring, because now they're coming out of winter with an exceptionally, I don't want to say no mites because there's no guarantee of that, but an exceptionally low mite population. Those bees are going to be really healthy, and if you stay on some sort of treatment regime, whether it be integrated pest management in spring, you'll keep that mite population at bay and make it much easier, a healthier colony that will produce lots of bees, lots of honey, and have a much greater chance of surviving not only winter, but also through the growing season. So you've got to plan ahead for the next year. And with that, I've got about 12 minutes before we conclude here this evening. So let me open up my question panel and see what we've got. How do you prep hives for a hurricane? Well, that's tough, given the devastating imagery that has been on the news over the past several weeks, and continues to be on the news, as we've got one pending, and has impacted islands in the Caribbean. That's tough. Lots of straps, lots of weight, anchor it down. I'm not sure. But our thoughts are with you. Which are organic controls? So this is regarding some of the treatments. So there's unfortunately nothing officially registered as an organic miticide in the United States. However, in other parts of the world, Europe, Canada, there are products that are registered as organic, and those include, not necessarily in all locations, but in some of those locations, the Mite Away Quick Strips, which is a formic acid-based product, organic acid. Formic acid naturally occurs in honey. It naturally occurs in nature. You could, if you've never used formic acid as a treatment, you could take a sample of honey, send it off to a laboratory, they'd test it and find formic acid in it. It's naturally occurring, it's there already, so you're not adding anything that's not already there. And they've also done the residue studies to show that after that treatment, there's no additional formic acid in that honey. It basically is the same level, same concentration as pre-treatment levels of formic. So that's a great product. Oxalic acid is also a great product. It's an organic acid. Rhubarb has lots of oxalic acid. Beet greens have, so if you've ever eaten beet greens, you've consumed oxalic acid. If you've ever eaten rhubarb, you've consumed oxalic acid. Sometimes that plant, gosh, I'm spacing the genus now. It's something like oxalic. Oxalis. Yeah, there it is. Oxalis has tons of oxalic acid in it, and often is added to salads. So if you've consumed that, you've consumed a lot of oxalic acid. So again, something that's not already there, or something that's there already, rather. Life Var, which is a mixture of essential oils. These would be three great products, three great options that are not considered hard chemicals and are considered organic in some places in the world, just not in the US. What is a sugar shake? So a sugar shake is a method of assessing the mite load of a colony. And in short, what you do is you take a mason jar of sorts, and if you're familiar with canning, you know that canning jars have what they call the band and the lid. It's a two-part lid, right? So the lid is sort of the disc that sits on top. The band is what fastens it, secures it to the jar. To do a sugar shake, you remove the lid and replace it with number 8 hardware cloth. So it's like a heavy-duty wire mesh. You replace it with hardware cloth, and what you do is you put a couple of tablespoons of powdered sugar in the jar. You get 300 bees, which is about a half a cup of bees. You put them in the jar with the powdered sugar. You put that band and hardware cloth on the top of the jar, screw it down, and you slosh those bees around inside that jar, and then you shake the sugar into a dish or a plate of some sort. And I find it easier once you've done that to then add a little water to the dish, because it dissolves the sugar and those mites jump out. They're visible as clear as day. So 300 bees in a jar with a couple of tablespoons of powdered sugar, slosh them around for a couple of minutes, shake the sugar out. You can then dump the bees back into the hive. They'll be nice white ghost bees, but they'll be welcome back into the hive, and you count up the mites. Now you put 300 bees in the jar, so if you have 3 mites in your dish, that's obviously easy math, 1 mite per 100 bees. So you're at the treatment threshold. If you have 4 mites per 300 bees, you're above the treatment threshold. So I just did a demonstration at a Mother Earth News Fair, and we had 9 mites per 300 bees. So that colony is well above the treatment threshold, and we've got to do something pretty immediate. Is the session recorded? It will be. It'll take us a couple of days to get. It probably won't be up on our YouTube channel until next week, but we do record these and put them up on our YouTube channel. How to treat in August with mite away when the temperatures are in the triple digits. So obviously, right, yes, some of these things are temperature sensitive, and so treating in August when triple digits exist would be a very bad idea. But also chances are that if you're in the triple digits in August, it means that your fall typically is going to start a little bit later. Your winter is going to set in a little bit later than if you're in an area that is maybe only double digits in August, which means you've got more time. So maybe you push it out. You're in one of those areas. Remember, I said late July, August, early September. Maybe you're late August, early September, or even into mid-September. If you're in a more southern state where the temperatures are a little bit warmer, a little bit later into the year. Should we treat regardless of mite levels through alcohol wash monitoring? My hives didn't reach treatment threshold until September 10th. Should I have treated anyway, assuming I would reach 1 mite per 100 bees? I'm sorry, 1 mite per 100 bees. Just down the road from us in Union Grove. So this is kind of a hot debate. I am, quite frankly, never one to treat prophylactically. And when I started in this industry 14 some years ago, the rule of thumb was don't treat unless you're at or above the treatment threshold. That rule of thumb, and this is largely from research, has changed so that if you've got a window of opportunity, you should take it. If you've got a window to treat in spring, summer, and fall, early spring, sometime in summer, and then late fall, you should work that treatment in. And here's why. Because you even stated this in your question, that you were not above the treatment threshold until 9-10. Now maybe that's just through natural biological reproduction of the mite. But there's this thing, I don't know how to call it, this event that we have documented in research, and not me, obviously, but researchers, we in the industry that have documented, called the Varroa bomb. And this gets back to that sort of notion of survivor stock, or just not dealing with Varroa in general. Here's what happens. And it's really fascinating. It's really scary, but it's really fascinating. So as a colony is declining due to high Varroa loads, high virus loads, it gets to a point where they abscond. Those bees just leave the hive. And actually, we hear this quite a bit in February and March. People will call us and say, I went in my hive just a month ago. They were looking great, and I came back, and now they're all gone. We know that that's largely attributed to viruses now, that absconding in the middle of winter when it just doesn't make sense. But it can also happen during the growing season. And so what happens when those bees abscond, they abandon ship because the ship's going down, where do they go? What happens to them? And there was a great study done a couple of years ago that they found these bees going to colonies in the surrounding landscape. And I think it was just last year they did the study where they actually identified colonies that they knew were going to die out. And so what they did is they marked a bunch of workers in those colonies and just let it run its course, see what happened. And sure enough, those colonies died. And then they surveyed all the colonies that they knew about in the surrounding landscape. And they found those marked workers from that colony that died in just about every colony in a 1.8-mile radius. And we refer to that as the Varroa bomb. You have a colony that's dying because of exceptionally high Varroa levels. And before it actually dies out completely, those surviving bees with all those lots of Varroa leave the hive and bring them back to those colonies in the surrounding landscape. So you could be doing everything right. You could be treating, you could be monitoring, and then all of a sudden one day, your colony has an exceptionally high Varroa level that can't be explained through the natural reproduction in the colony. That is a Varroa bomb. And that's one of the reasons why this notion of survivor stock, treatment free, is really not working. Unless we can get everyone in the industry to treat their colonies in a uniform way, in other words, don't do anything, and then all of us breed from survivor stock. Survivor stocks, it's going to take a really, really long time. But I'll tell you what, you're never going to get people to agree to that. Not because they don't care about the bees, but because think about that. What happens to the price of apples? What happens to even the non-beekeepers would be outraged by the price of food because now we don't have the pollination services that our industry provides to our agricultural systems. It would be devastating not only to the bee industry, but to the agricultural industry if we were to adopt such a strategy. It's just never going to happen. So I'm not a fan of prophylactic treating, but when it comes to Varroa, I certainly do. What about keeping pollen patties on the top frames during winter, especially those infused with honeybee healthy? So pollen, so the bees, as we may or may not know, they really need two sources of food, protein and carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are most important for fueling the colony in winter. That's what fuels the furnace to keep them warm going through winter. But in early spring, and early spring for colonies is in January, February, as the days begin to increase in length, the queen responds to that increased daylight by starting to lay eggs, regardless of what temperature it is outside. Now, the temperature influences how many eggs and how big that brood nest gets, but she'll start to lay eggs well before well before there's a natural source of pollen. And the pollen is protein that they need for the developing brood, the baby bees. So pollen patties are important at that time of year. Now, there's no harm in putting them on in the fall and letting them try and store it. Typically, though, I've seen them more consume than store those patties. I tend to feed the carbohydrate in fall to get the fuel that they need in that colony. And then in early spring, I'll start putting in some pollen patties to give them the protein that they need to fuel to grow the colony with the developing brood. What is the difference between an 8-frame or 10-frame Vivaldi board? So it just there's two different sized colonies. There's I should say two different sized, not colonies, two different sizes in equipment in terms of width. There's different heights, but widths. So a 10-frame box holds 10 frames. It's a little bit wider. An 8-frame box holds 8 frames, a little bit more narrow. So it just refers to what size equipment you're using. Does your equipment hold 10 or does it hold 8? That's the only difference between the two of them. So my hives are on hive stands and I use screen bottom boards. What is your advice about leaving the screen bottom boards open or cover them up? So that's another really hotly debated topic. I was talking with a beekeeper just a week or two ago, and they like the solid bottom boards. Me personally, I like the screened bottom boards. And I also, if it's one of ours, we've got that sheet that goes in there for mite monitoring. I will also keep that out pretty much all the time unless I want to monitor for mites. I find that in wintertime, there's going to be some natural mortality that occurs inside that hive. Bees, no matter how much we do and try, some bees are just going to naturally die. There's no way to avoid that. So when those bees die and that colony is clustered, they're not going to be removing them from the hive. So they're going to accumulate on your bottom board. I find that having that screen there helps that keep those bees from molding and helps aerate them so they're not quite as wet and creating those health issues. I also find that it helps a bit with ventilation. So I find keeping it open advantageous as opposed to closing or solid bottom boards. And just as to mention, I felt the same way when I was in New York State in near the Adirondacks, where it was much colder for longer periods of time than it is here in North Carolina. So with that, we've reached our 7 o'clock mark. There's lots more questions here. I'm sorry I couldn't get to them all, but please feel free to reach out to us, email us, call us. We've got live chat on our website. You can live chat us and ask these questions. We want to make sure that we get you the answers or do the best we can to get you the answers. We don't know everything. There's no beekeepers that do, but we'll certainly do our best if we don't know the answer to try and find it for you so that you've got good information to make good decisions. So thanks for attending. I really do appreciate it. Good luck. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Thank you. Bye-bye.